and will be available via the Neudesic website in about a week's time. We will email you this link when it becomes available. Now, if everyone is ready, please make sure your seat color is green, and at this time, I'd like to turn our presentation over to Monish.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into our topic today, I'd like to do a quick poll to better understand the audience. So you should see the poll come up on your live meeting screen. And basically what I'd like to understand is, what is your role within your organization? Okay. Give everyone an opportunity to answer here. Okay, so it looks like it's about a three-way split between developers, architects, and technical decision makers. All right, great. Okay, so we have a pretty mixed crowd. And since this topic is service-oriented architecture, I'd also like to understand if you've been involved in a SOA initiative at your organization. Looks like it's about a split. A few more responses. Oh, I guess it's a split. All right, great. Good to know. Okay, so we'll get started with our presentation here. Like Katie mentioned, this is the iterative approach to service-oriented architecture. I do want to point out that this is the first in a series of presentations in the bite-sized SOA series. So please keep an eye out on the Neudesic webcast Neudesic website area for the webcast, and you'll see that there's 2 more presentations coming up in the upcoming months. And as a follow-on, we'll actually be having in-person dinner events on the same topic after those webcasts online. So if you're interested, please make sure that you stick around towards the end to capture the contact information. So if you're interested, please go ahead and let us know, and we'll make sure to get you added to our list. So before I start talking about service-oriented architecture, I'd like us to step back for a moment and really talk about our business today. Businesses are experiencing a lot of problems these days. Problems like limited resources, ability to compete with other organizations. A lot of organizations are investing a lot of money, but they're still not able to get the growth that they're expecting. So there are a whole host of problems. But there's one problem that if a business were to solve, it would essentially solve all the other problems, and that's flexibility. Just imagine, if you were flexible, you could adjust your offerings to changes in your customers' demand. Imagine if you had the flexibility, you could just change your products and offerings very quickly and efficiently. And if you have a very rich talent pool, if you have the flexibility, you could maximize productivity by leveraging that talent pool. So that's, from a business perspective, there are a lot of things we could do to become more flexible. But now let's look at specifically at IT. Think of how the business can leverage IT so it can be more flexible. And at the same token, think of how IT itself can become more flexible to meet the needs of the business. So there's one central theme here that's in this concept of flexibility, and that's the notion of change. Businesses today are dealing with a lot of pressure for change, both internal and external. Companies are looking to cut costs, make do with a lot of the existing resources that they have. They're dealing with more competition. Their customer requirements are changing. As you can see, the economic downturn has had an impact on almost everyone. So your customer requirements are changing, and so you have to adapt to those external changes in your organization. So when you take a look at all these external changes, when you look back at your organization internally, you should see if your organization itself has changed over the last 5 years. Look at some of the processes that were established 5 years ago. Have they still remained the same? Are there any redundant processes that were introduced over time that no one really realized them? So it's very important to look at these processes, even internal to your organization, on a regular basis to see if it's something can be improved there. Now, it's in human nature to resist change, so it's no different for large organizations to do the same. But at the same time, we're not trying to change human nature. We just want to recognize the fact that change is an important factor that we need to consider if you want to increase our flexibility. So it really helps to think of change as a positive force in business, and because it enables you to respond to change, leverage it, so that you can gain the competitive advantage. Well, now that we've recognized that we can become more flexible, and there are changes that we need to deal with as an organization, the next step really is to identify those changes. Now, there's two types of changes. There's your known changes and your unknown changes. The economic downturn could be potentially an unknown change for some organizations. They were not able to plan or foresee the economic downturn. For some organizations, a natural disaster could be an unknown change. They may be able to plan for it, but they may not have any sort of lead time to know about when it's going to happen. Regulatory compliance, that's a potential known change. If your organization has to comply to some government law within 2 years, that's something that you can plan for. So determine which of these changes you want to really deal with as an organization, and really choose which ones are going to provide you the most value. You may decide to ignore some changes, so that's certainly acceptable. But just recognize the fact that you have these changes. This process that we're going through from a business perspective, where we're recognizing that there's inflexibilities in the organization and we're preparing for the changes of the future, is service orientation. Specifically, when you put on your IT glasses, you start looking at it, service orientation really takes advantage of IT to increase its flexibility and really enable your organization to deal with change. Okay? So great. I know change is coming. I'd love to become more service oriented. Where do I start? Well, keep in mind that SOA is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. You don't spend you don't invest in a 5-year-long SOA project, and at the end of it you have a service-oriented architecture. You may not. It's going to be an ongoing process. The last thing you want to do is boil the ocean. You don't want to start a multi-million-dollar, multi-year SOA project with a lot of cost and risk. So instead, what we've seen work really well for our clients is a SOA pilot project. And we recommend that clients really start with a pilot, really understand their capabilities, and then build that gradually over time. And we specifically recommend identifying one or two key business problems that your organization is facing today that really limits your flexibility, and really go after those problems. Now, one of the natural tendencies to this approach is that some organizations tend to treat SOA as a hammer against a bunch of nails, your problems in your organization. So it's very careful. You want to be very careful about not doing that. SOA is not going to be an approach for every single problem that you have in your company. So make sure that you focus on the business problem at hand, and then see if a service-oriented approach will solve that problem. If it doesn't, you could discard that problem. Maybe there's a different solution for it. But identify those problems that are going to have a service-oriented approach, and then solve those first. To give you an example, I had an opportunity to work with a large government healthcare organization. Their current platform for receiving HL7 and flat file data from over 200-300 partners was just not very reliable for them. It just was not working out for the amount of load that they were expecting. They were having a lot of issues onboarding new partners. They had several hundred partners already, and they were expecting another 100 and within the span of a couple more years. and they were also expecting their message size and message load to go up over the years as well. So they decided that there are some key success factors that if they were to implement in their new platform, they could migrate off of their existing platform to address those business needs. So they decided to embark on a SOA pilot project. In this particular case, the pilot project happened to be around 2 months, and they identified some key success factors, and they built out the infrastructure. They built out a solution to prove that they could really go after those pain points that they had in their old platform, and they were able to deliver that. Now, mind you, this wasn't a complete solution, a complete replacement for the existing solution, but it created the architecture and really the groundwork needed to build on top of that. And so they found that to be really helpful, and they feel very comfortable as an organization using this as a foundation to build and migrate the rest of the solution. So there are a lot of benefits of a pilot project besides the ones I was talking about. Obviously, it's a great way to bring acceptance of SOA within your organization. If your organization has not heard the word, if your business team does not understand it, it's a great way to introduce the organization to it and really get both your technical and business teams to understand the value behind SOA. It's also a great way to get the technical team up to speed. There are a lot of really important best practices that developers have to be familiar with to be involved on a service-oriented project. So it's very important to go through that process and get your technical team very familiar with some of the best practices and then the methodologies. And it's also a very good opportunity for you to fine-tune some of the existing methodologies you have in place. Some organizations may still be doing using a waterfall methodology. So, it may be initially a challenge because in a SOA pilot, we're going to be very iterative. The tendency is going to be very iterative to deliver software in an incremental fashion. And so your Agile, your Scrum methodologies, basically your iterative approaches, are going to be more helpful for you in your SOA pilot. So it's also an opportunity to really look at those methodologies closer to meet your SOA initiatives. And you may, in the process, decide that you want to evaluate some commercial products that can help you with your SOA rollout. Obviously, there are a number of products out there. Certainly, a lot of an enterprise service bus product is a key component of SOA from an implementation perspective. They are business process management, the BPM suites out there. There's also a number of products out there that let you set up your governance for your SOA infrastructure. So this is a good opportunity for you to look at what products are going to be best suited for your organization as well. Now, there are certainly certain things you want to watch out for, and I would say by far the most important one is lack of an executive. Most important one would be lack of executive support. You want to make sure that your SOA initiative has enough visibility within your organization. Clients that I've worked with that have started on department-focused SOA initiatives have been successful, but they don't have the same business impact that an organization-wide initiative has. So it's very important to raise the awareness, raise the visibility of your pilot to more than just one department, preferably several departments. And it's very important to have support from an executive sponsor that can really champion the pilot for you. This is the second most important. You want to make sure that you have a very experienced architect. An experienced architect has already gone through this process before. They've assisted companies with SOA pilot projects. They understand the maturity model. They understand that organizations are going to be starting out at different levels within that maturity model. This individual is also going to be working very closely with the technical team on some of the architecture and the design. And on the other end, they'll be working very closely with the business analysts of your organization to really look at your processes and see how they can be optimized, how they can be re-engineered for service orientation. And oftentimes, they become the champion for the project, and they're even selling the concept to the entire organization, whether it's down at the technical level or all the way up to the executive level. So an experienced architect is very important. This is certainly important, and I think this stands true for any project. You want to make sure that you're absolutely clear about what you're delivering in the SOA initiative. And you want to make sure you do this at all levels within the organization. When you're defining the deliverables, the portfolio that you plan to deliver as part of the pilot, you want to make sure that it's something that you can go after, but at the same time, don't set your expectations so high that they're going to be outside of, that you're not going to be able to go after them. So remember that this is a pilot project, and you're going to have some challenges if this is the first time you're going through it. So be very upfront with everyone in your organization about what you'll be really delivering. This is a very common tendency. In fact, I have an example for this I can tell you about. Developers who are involved on SOA initiatives often focus just on web services. And the other thing that goes along with this is building services for the sake of services. So you want to be very careful with both of these. You can certainly have a SOA without any web services at all. And when we talk a couple more slides, we'll talk about what a service is really all about. But really, you can have SOA without any web services, and likewise, you can have a bunch of web services and not have a SOA. So it's very important that you focus on your business problem at hand to determine what services you need to build. And that's what should drive your service definition, not building services wherever you can build it. One particular organization that I worked with where the IT team had a SOA pilot initiative, and they spent roughly a year to build out, I think an entire service portfolio for the business. So they spent a year, built the service portfolio, took it to the business, and presented it to them. And to their surprise, the business team was very disappointed with the work. And their service portfolio, they were thinking of services like logging service, exception handling service, data access service. These are services that provide value, certainly, but it only helped the IT team develop projects maybe incrementally faster because they had these services. When you ask the business team, they didn't really see the value in these services. They were more interested in solving some of their business problems. They were interested in a service that gave them a consolidated view of their customer. They have all these applications, all these systems that have different views of the customer, and they wanted a service that provided a consolidated view for that. In some insurance organizations, they're looking at how they can optimize their claims processes. They've got so many different claims processing for each of their lines of businesses. They're looking how they could consolidate that process into a single unified claims process. So it's very important to keep the business problem at hand, and it's very important that you get your business engaged. SOA is really all about getting business and IT working together. So I'd be very careful of building a bunch of services. So some of the key things you want to make sure that you have as part of your pilot, one of the most important things you want to have is really an architectural plan. The architectural plan really will define how business and IT will work together. Because really that's really what you're trying to solve here. How will IT respond to the constant changes at the business environment? And how will the business be able to communicate those changes to IT? So the architectural plan is going to have high-level overview of how you plan to do that. You'll certainly have some of the details of your architecture as well, where you're defining your services, you're defining your design, defining what level of compliance you'll have within the maturity model. You also want to make sure you have a very specific scope. We did talk about services. You want to make sure that you know exactly the services that you want to build for your SOA pilot. And not only that, you want to make sure you build the right services. So you want to make sure that you go through the process of identifying the business processes, decompose them, and then determine which of those services you want to build. And we'll see this process in a couple more slides here. You also want to make sure you have a clear acceptance criteria. So at the end of the pilot, you know that you can look at the outcome and you can say that yes, we've reached our goal, we've accomplished what we wanted to do. So I mean, one of the components of good acceptance criteria is obviously the architectural design. You want to make sure that the architectural design will support your pilot, but it should also support subsequent initiatives after the pilot. So that should be defined in your criteria that you want to make sure you meet that requirement in your design. You also want to make sure you have reusable business services. One of the key tenets of SOA is reusability. So it's very important that when you go through that process of decomposing your business processes, you have to define what services are going to be reusable at the end of the pilot. And you may also decide that you need to define your governance criteria so that your future projects have something to have a foundation to sit on. This particular one is actually kind of central to the whole approach of how you go through the pilot, and that's really iterating during the pilot and just iterating in every process that you'll be following during your SOA pilot project. Iterations really help you refine what you'll be defining. When you embark on this project, you'll realize that when you're talking to different people in your departments, you have a lot of different people that you haven't interacted with before. There are a lot of new systems that you may find in this process. So it's very important that you have an iteration where you spend some time talking to individuals, understanding the systems that you have better so that you can capture that information, define some processes, define some services. And in the process, you may decide you have to come back and gather more information. And also, iterations help you reduce the risk even within your pilot. What we recommend to a lot of our clients is to have them produce a measurable output at the end of each iteration. You almost want to have something that you can take to production at the end of each iteration. And you want to start getting immediate feedback from that, whatever you delivered at the end of each iteration. You want to start getting feedback from its use back into your pilot project. So this is really central to what you want to accomplish in the pilot and even long-term beyond the pilot. Okay, so now that we know that we want to start a pilot, let's look at some of the approaches that you would take to really look at some of your business problems. So the first approach we'll look at here is the top-down approach. And in this approach, we start by identifying some business problems that we have today. And maybe we're trying to optimize our loan origination process. And in this process, obviously, there are going to be a number of steps involved. And so you can think of steps as an individual within the company that's interacting with a system or interacting with an individual, or any of the steps, whether it's manual or automated, a series of steps that really let feed as an input to the business process. In this top-down approach, you look at those business processes and really break them down and see what services we can build to facilitate a service-oriented approach. So in this case, there's obviously a number of steps, and each of those steps may require a number of services that don't exist today. Maybe a user is using an application directly and they're doing some manual data entry. So we may decide that we need to build a service on top of that application so that we can expose an interface for automating that functionality. So this approach, at the end of the approach, you're going to have basically a bunch of services that you may need to build as part of that process decomposition. Now let's look at the bottom-up approach. In this approach, we look at all the applications that we have. We look at all the existing assets in your organization, and we look at what services we need to build so that we can automate some of the functionality that we have today. So we essentially look at the applications, define some services, and then at the end of that, you can then combine the services as part of larger business processes. And in this approach, this is really called service definition. Now, what we've seen with a lot of the organizations that take the bottom-up approach is that there's really no control as to what services they need to build. It's very easy to look at all those applications you own and start building services on top of every application. That's the key pitfall that I mentioned before about building services for the sake of services. And likewise, the top-down approach has the same problem too. You're starting with breaking down your business processes, but once you've chosen what services you want to build, you don't know whether those services are necessarily going to be available within your application. You haven't gone down deep enough yet. And you may start solving every single business problem and defining services for all of those. So we recommend that you follow more of a middle-out approach. And in this approach, you're identifying one or two key business problems, decomposing the processes behind those problems into some services that are actually going to be valuable just for that problem. And then once you've gone through that, you immediately come back and you build some services, whether it's on top of existing applications, maybe some products that you purchased off the shelf, or some services that were purchased off the shelf. And you use those services and map them directly to the process to provide you value. This ensures that you're very focused on what you're building, and you're not just building services for the sake of services. Okay, so I did mention that we'll talk about what a service is all about. A service is really just an interface to a piece of software, whether that's a legacy application that you have sitting in your IT environment, or it's an application that exposes potentially some native APIs. And so it's just a piece of functionality that you're exposing so that other applications potentially or other users can consume that functionality. Services have both consumers and providers. The provider is the one providing the functionality from the service, and the consumer is the one that's leveraging the functionality by consuming it. Services generally interact via messages. If you're familiar with integration products or Smalltalk, you're familiar with the message paradigm, but really they focus on messages, and we'll see more when we learn a little bit more about messages when we talk about loose coupling as well. Services can have standards-based interfaces, but they don't have to. You can expose a service over maybe a HIPAA standard or an HL7 standard, but it doesn't have to be. It can certainly be a native standard. Now, having a standards-based interface certainly increases its availability and it's the possibility that someone will be able to understand it and use it. But it doesn't have to be necessarily a standards-based interface. A service can also have varying degrees of coupling. Ideally, we always want to achieve loose coupling. And so you want to make sure that the services that you build are very loosely coupled. But just keep in mind that depending on how you build it, it can certainly be very tightly coupled as well. So let's briefly talk about loose coupling. Loose coupling is one of those things that really seems easy. You know, it's like the skater that when you watch them skating on the ice arena, it just looks so easy. But the reality is it is difficult. And if you have not done it within your organization, if you have not built loosely coupled solutions, then it may be a challenge initially. So here's some guidelines that you want to make sure you follow to ensure that you're at least coming on the becoming a little bit more loosely coupled than you are today. So you want to make sure that one of the things you do is define contracts. And contract is really just an agreement between the consumer and the provider. And both parties will make sure that they adhere to that agreement when they interact with each other. And you want to expose that contract via abstractions. So when someone's building a service, you want to make sure that you don't, there are a lot of implementation details behind the service. You want to make sure that you abstract a lot of those details away and really expose a contract that's well-defined and just enough for what the consumer needs to leverage your functionality in the service. This is very important. You want to make sure that you insulate any changes in your service, any changes that you plan to make in your service, and make sure that your consumer is insulated from them. So this is one of the key things here, and making sure that you can accomplish this will actually increase your it will make you more loosely coupled. And you want to expose those contracts over specific interfaces. So let's take a look at a diagram here. So on the left there you have the consumer, on the right you have the provider, and you can see that you have the purple rectangular box there on the right side. The provider's that's the provider's contract, and you can see that they have both internal, the P sub I, and the P sub E, and an external interface to it. So this ensures that the implementation behind both the provider and consumer are not directly tied to each other. Okay, so we're ensuring that we're using a messaging layer and a separate external interface between the consumer and provider, and that enables us to achieve loose coupling. Okay, so now that we understand what a service is and we've talked about some of the approaches, let's look at an example. Let's look at a process, and then let's go through all the steps that we talked about. So I picked employee onboarding, and in this particular organization, their current process takes them about 1 month to get an employee fully onboarded. I've had the opportunity to work for organizations where it's taken less than a week. So that's a very long time. Requires a lot of manual data entry into multiple systems, so it could potentially take longer depending on if someone's absent or if they have not entered information yet. And it's also time-consuming for the supervisor because the supervisor has to determine the status of that the onboarding process. So, and at the end of the day, it can result in a lot of increased costs because the employee may not be familiar, or they may not be fully oriented with some of the policies and procedures. So they make mistakes initially and really start learning on the job during that period. So it could be costly for the organization as well. So let's start by decomposing that process. So we'll look at the steps that they're following today. So we have step 1, where the employee fills out an employment form with their personal information. They send it over to HR. And then HR adds that employee to the employee database and registers them for orientation. Now, I'm simplifying this a bit, but you can certainly imagine that there could be a series of other small subtasks that person could be following to get this task done. Okay? And the subsequent step, the payroll employee actually adds the new employee to the payroll system and sets up direct deposit for them. And lastly, we get the IT team involved, and we have them set up credentials for the new employee in a system, in a directory system such as Active Directory. So now that we've gone through and decomposed that process, let's look at what services can we build. Well, we look at some of the applications. We just took the top-down approach. Now we're coming up from the bottom. We look at some of the applications that we have here. We have our employee database, we have our payroll system, and our directory application. Let's build some fine-grained services on top of those applications. These fine-grained services are very specific, and they are catered to really expose specific pieces of functionality from those back-end applications. And maybe these services don't exist today. Maybe all the processes or all the interactions are manual. So by that I mean a user has to log in and enter information into the employee database. But if someone from the payroll department has to enter all the information manually in the payroll system. So we're exposing some interfaces, some services that can automate some of this functionality for us. And let's also build what's called a core screen service. So this is a slightly larger service in scope, and its responsibility is to aggregate the fine-grained services to provide the necessary functionality. And so we've called this core screen service new employee service. Okay. So we've gone through that. We've gone through the process of decomposition. We identified some services, and we can potentially go out there and build these services now. And we may recognize that some of these services already exist before we even build them. So let's look at what we would do next. The next step is to really map your process back to these services you built. And so some of this may involve looking at some of your existing user-facing applications, enhancing them to leverage these services. So what we're going to do is map. We're going to simplify our process a bit. Now the employee will still have to fill out an employment form with all the relevant information. But we're going to simplify it for HR a bit because we're going to just have them review the employment form and then just provision access to all the downstream systems. Because the HR application is just going to leverage the new employee service, which has its own responsibilities of actually getting that data down to all the downstream systems. Okay, so this is how we're able to really abstract the HR application from any changes underneath because we've mapped it directly to our new employee service. So imagine this is the process you've gone through. You've taken potentially a 4-step process and you brought it down to 2 steps. Now I've certainly ignored some of the other steps in employee onboarding. There's of course set up in your 401k, your health care benefits. There's plenty of other things, but we're focused on some very specific steps within the process here. So let's say that you've gone through the first iteration and you've delivered that the services and you delivered those processes and you've really provided some specific value. Maybe you brought that month process down to 2 weeks and you started using that immediately. So you're already seeing the gain from that. And then you go out to see if there's any other problems they can solve. So we recognize that there's also a background check. And we know that we want to tune our process so that our background check doesn't take as long. So that's a manual step today, and we potentially, maybe we interact with an external vendor to get the background check done for us. So let's look at all, what we already have. We've got all the services that we built. We've got some applications. Now, let's say we decide to choose a vendor that has a background screening system. And so we recognize that that's an application, potential system that we need to interact with. So we will build a fine-grained service, really an interface that exposes that functionality from your background screening vendor. So this could be, as simple as maybe over an FTP or a web service that goes out and talks to the background screening vendor system. And then we just map that background service to our new employee service. So we just essentially add another responsibility for our new employee service to call that background service. And from a process perspective, the HR application still, is responsible for reviewing the employment form, reviewing that all the necessary information is there, and then the application itself then still communicates with the new employee service and is not impacted by the underlying changes and the fact that you've added an additional service, fine-grained service down below. Okay. So this approach, as you can see, obviously at some points you may have some changes where may propagate all the way up to your applications. So that's certainly going to be natural, but you want to always try to minimize those changes so that your consumers, your service consumers, are not impacted by that. And so that's where some of the advanced topics we can go into, like schema versioning, and really looking at how we can track our schemas, track our portfolios when we're going through a lot of changes. You can look at that as well. So, and if you're looking at the SOA maturity model, you may not be initially concerned with all of this either. As you can see, this is the SOA maturity model. Ideally, going through a pilot project should get you to at least the basic level. And this is not a guarantee, but certainly that's what you would like to attain. You'd like to get to a point where whatever you built is at least usable. So at a minimum, you'll have some design patterns established. You have some development processes that you've defined. You've defined how you're going to test your service-oriented architecture. You've got well-defined contracts. You've defined some level of security on top of services so that you don't have anyone consuming them. And you have some basic monitoring on top of what you built so that you can track the health of the system. And as you can see, once we start going up the levels of the maturity model, you're really looking to seriously increase your capabilities and what you can provide. So after the basic level, you're going to the standardized, where you're getting to a point where you can repeat this, and you're getting very good at providing this and becoming flexible to really respond to your changing business needs. And then after the standardized, you're getting to advanced, where you have some advanced auditing, monitoring capabilities so that you can support this system. And then by far the highest level would be the dynamic in the maturity model, and you're really able to do some advanced things like provide analytics on all the services that you've exposed, and even down to things like an SDK, so that a new developer starting on your SOA initiative can easily come up to speed on how they need to build services. So I'd like to take a break here for a moment and just ask everyone, some of you may be familiar with this maturity model, some of you may not, so I'd like to just understand and see if you are familiar with it and see where you think you are or where your organization is in this maturity model. So there should be a live meeting poll screen showing up on your screen. I'll give everyone an opportunity to answer here. Looks like it's adding up. Quite a few are in the at the basic level. Okay. Okay, that's great to see that. Quite a few are at the basic level, and about 2 of you are in the standardized. Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about this maturity model, and also we really appreciate the opportunity to discuss an iterative approach to service-oriented architecture. So keep in mind that there are subsequent webcasts coming up in the upcoming months. So please do come back and let us know if we can answer any questions for you. At this point, I'll turn it over to Katie in case we have any questions.
Great. Thanks, Monish. This was a great presentation. We did have a few questions come through. The first question is, what is the typical duration of a SOA pilot initiative?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to have to give the architect answer of it depends. Well, really, the SOA pilot can be anywhere between a couple of months all the way up to a year. So I definitely don't recommend your pilot project going over a year, because then you start losing visibility, and you know, you can really get if you have a multi-year project, you may not start seeing the value that you're expecting. So I generally recommend that as an organization, you look more towards the business problems, and also time box yourself to solve some of those business problems within that time frame. So I would say no more than a year for most organizations. If you're smaller, you can do it within months. Great.
Great. Next question. At what point and at what level do you recommend implementing governance?
Yes, that's a good question. As you can see in the SOA maturity model, within the basic level, we're talking about some level of basic monitoring. So if you're looking at some products for that, or if whatever you've built better have some level of monitoring, so that when you start getting into to the next level, you can actually support this system. So I would say you need to, as part of your architectural plan that we talked about, you need to at least determine what level of governance you want to have going into the pilot. And so this is going to be a conversation with your business. You need to be upfront with your business, and you need to tell them that you may not be able to support the system during the pilot or initially after the pilot. And you need to make it clear that supportability is going to be the next initiative in your pilot project.
Okay, great. Please let us know if that answers your question or if you need any additional information or clarification. We had another question come in. It says, I am really interested in using SOA and HL7. Can I get more information about your experience integrating the two?
Yes, we can certainly do that. We've helped a lot of customers with HL7 messaging and how they can do it in a service-oriented fashion. I think we'll have Katie's contact information afterwards here, so please get hold of us, and we can certainly help you at any level or any level of help that we can provide.
Okay, great. And another question came in. How do I sell the concept of SOA pilot to my business?
That's good, yeah. If you recall, what we're talking about very early on during the presentation is we're really trying to solve a business problem. So when you're selling the concept, you want to make sure that you tell the business that you want to make the IT better so that they can respond to your business. Right? So business is going to be all over that. They're interested in, if IT has not been working well for the business, they're going to be interested in how IT can operate better and how the business can work with IT better so that they can get their needs addressed. So make sure that you focus back on the business problems. You have to understand the day-to-day issues in the business, and that's how I would really sell that idea to your business.
Great. Now, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to type them in at this time. In the meantime, I'm going to click through a few polling questions, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. First question is, was this content helpful for your business? Thank you everyone who's participating. Go to the next question. Please rate the presentation content. Excellent, good, poor. Great, it looks like this information was very helpful. Last question, would you like us to schedule a follow-up? Again, thank you everyone for your feedback. Give everyone one last second. Okay. Great, and if there are no further questions at this time, it doesn't look like there are. We would like to thank Monish for this wonderful presentation. We will be forwarding out the recorded version of this presentation when it becomes available in just a few days' time. Now, if you have any further questions about this presentation or Neudesic in general, please feel free to email me. My email contact information is up on the screen now. And also, if anyone would like any further information about our in-person bite-sized SOA events, please feel free to reach out to me directly. We will also be sending out follow-up emails with information included as well. There will also be 2 other webcast series, bite-sized SOA webcast series, coming up in the near future. We would love for all of you to participate in those as well. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. You are now free to disconnect.
Thank you.